Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday, and this is Seattle Now. The gig economy has suddenly become uber visible, pun intended. We're holed up in our homes, endlessly scrolling through Amazon for things we need and some things we don't. And just as we're relying on them more, we're also seeing the risks that gig workers take for our convenience. KUOW's Joshua McNichols is here to tell us what's up in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. The Seattle Mariners sent a message in support of the Black Lives Matter movement last night after the NBA's Milwaukee Bucks didn't show for a playoff game, and just hours before they were supposed to play the Padres in San Diego, M's players voted unanimously to not take the field. Second baseman D. Gordon tweeted, "Instead of watching us, we hope people will focus on the things more important than sports that are happening." The game has been rescheduled for later today. Hey, young people, we need to talk. The State Department of Health says you really need to put down that vape pen. There are a lot of you using e-cigarettes. The department says nearly 30% of high school seniors report that they're vaping. And a new study says that makes you 5 times more likely to test positive for COVID-19 than other people. The state is making resources available if you'd like to quit and need some help. Secretary of State Kim Wyman is taking more steps to make sure voters get their ballots in time this year. Any ballots sent out within 15 days of the election will now be mailed first class. That means it'll take 2 to 5 days for them to arrive instead of up to 10 days. The Postal Service says you should try to get your ballot in a mailbox a week before Election Day if you can, and you can always drop it into a ballot box. If you've ordered packages on Amazon or get dinner delivered from your favorite Thai food place, odds are you're relying on a gig worker to do it. A lot of us are right now. These workers make it fast and pretty cheap to do all sorts of things because they don't get the protections that full-time employees get. But COVID is forcing changes to the gig economy. Joshua McNichols has been reporting on gig workers during the pandemic, and he's here to tell us how COVID is changing things. Hey, Joshua.
Hey.
So when we say gig worker, we're talking about that guy or that gal who's delivering the groceries I've ordered online, or maybe the food I've ordered from a delivery app like Grubhub, right? Who else?
Well, everything from, dog walkers to house sitters to delivering packages for Amazon. Uber drivers, that's another kind of gig work. A lot of them have shifted to Uber Eats right now. It's all kinds of people. I mean, there are people who've left professional careers to do gig work because they love the flexibility of it, being able to set their own hours, take off for vacations whenever they want, And then there's also people who are trying to make ends meet, who are sort of desperate for a little cash to make their rent at the end of the month or something.
Okay, so it's obvious to me that business is booming for these kinds of jobs right now because I see people delivering all over town outside my window. I see the drivers lined up outside the restaurants on the Ave in the University District. They are picking up food all day long. Are these gig workers doing well right now?
Well, you're right that business is booming in some parts of the gig economy. It's languishing in other parts, right? The pandemic basically wiped out half of the work on half of the platforms. But also the number of gig workers is booming too. And many of them are having a hard time making a living right now because there's so much competition.
So there's a lot of people trying to pick up that same delivery, competing for the exact same job at that Thai food place that I've just ordered from.
Exactly.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot of hustle involved in being a gig worker. How do gig workers actually try to make this work and translate this into a living?
Right. I spoke to a gig worker named Orlando Santana, and he starts his day by opening Amazon Flex. He's looking for jobs there, which are called blocks.
So like right now, I'll look for the Amazon blocks because I know they're guaranteed, so I'll have them. So I'll try for like half an hour to an hour trying to get those. And if I don't, then I'll open up Instacart and see what they have available. I could see what they have available right now.
Like after Instacart, he looks at Shipt, which shops and delivers for Target. And at lunchtime, he looks at DoorDash, which delivers meals. But that's kind of his last resort. That's his least favorite. I mean, before the pandemic, he'd have like 7 different gig platforms that he'd check. And he'd take his time deciding which jobs to take. But the pandemic wiped out the work on half of those, and everybody swarmed to the platforms that still have work. Plus, there's all the other unemployed people trying to do gig work for the first time. So now when Instacart tosses its jobs out for you to look at on the app, it's like somebody threw a bucket of fish parts over the side of a boat into a bunch of sharks.
Well, and what does that mean? Because it sounds like he doesn't even have the opportunity to decide if this job is even worth it before he has to decide to take it.
That's right. That's exactly the problem that he's facing. After he factors in all his costs, oftentimes he finds that he's ending up with some pretty lousy jobs.
You're stuck with, accepting $7, $8 to go do, 45 minutes, an hour's worth of work.
And, that doesn't sound like a very good deal. I'm curious how gig type companies are responding to this situation for their workers, on behalf of their workers.
Well, some say there's not a problem. Like, for example, this guy, Orlando Santana, that I talked to, he says his income has fallen by half. But when you talk to Instacart, they say, when you look at all their workers, the pay has risen. So they don't see there as being a giant systemic problem. There are these small areas where they say they've improved things for workers. For example, there was this problem that was happening. Instacart said it was a very minor problem, but I've heard about it from multiple Instacart workers who are called shoppers. And they say that some customers were putting in really big tips to start with to attract them to do a job. And then after the job was completed, they were going in and zeroing out that tip. So they actually earned far less than they thought.
What a horrible thing to do.
I know.
I'm sorry.
Right?
That's a terrible, terrible thing to do.
Yeah. And I mean, to be clear, like, what was much more common, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, people were tipping Instacart workers very highly for their work because we were sort of celebrating them as essential workers. And that was the sort of larger cultural thing that was happening. But there were sort of on the edges these things happening where they were getting ripped off for certain jobs. So one thing Instacart's doing in that case is they're cracking down on those customers who show that pattern of behavior and just closing their accounts.
Sure. And base pay is really just one of the things that we're talking about here because gig workers have been fighting for benefits for a really long time, like sick pay and unemployment and health insurance. And since the pandemic, they have actually gotten some of those things. But like the really high tips we were seeing in the beginning, is this something that's likely to last for the long term?
Well, no and yes. I mean, for example, the hazard pay, which is called premium pay that gig workers got in Seattle during the pandemic, like that expires after the pandemic's over. So that's $2.50 per job that they'll just lose, right? But on the other hand, there's been this sort of shift in how we think about these things. For example, Uber and Lyft drivers, the city has been working for years on saying, should we have a way of establishing sort of a base pay? They're finally getting to the point where they can enact that legislation. And I was watching this briefing to the city council where they're talking about this. And one of the city council members is like, I love this, but like, how can we expand this to all gig work, right? And the representative from the mayor's office is like, well, we're looking at that. Right? That's next. Uber and Lyft, we've had a long time to work on, but we see this as sort of the next step in that.
So there are two things happening here, Joshua. We rely on this system clearly, but we also are seeing the real problems in it and the risks that these essential workers are taking. How are these things going to resolve?
Well, I mean, one thing that's happening now during the pandemic is we've seen a little bit of a shift in the balance of power. And I think some of these things will resolve differently than they would have before the pandemic just because of that shift. Like, for example, in years past, if Uber and Lyft didn't like the way that government was approaching regulation of that industry, they could put out an email and say, aren't you customers furious that the government wants to change your ability to have an affordable ride whenever you want? They didn't use those words, obviously, but they had ways of sort of drumming up outrage, and that would lead to backlashes against regulation. But, culturally, our awareness of the risks that gig workers face has fundamentally changed. And furthermore, there's very few people using Uber and Lyft right now. So
it's a double whammy.
So when Uber and Lyft put out press releases that are meant to drum up a little bit of outrage against, for example, what California is doing, where they're trying to get gig workers to be listed as employees, there's not the same level of outrage as there was in the early days of Uber and Lyft. So I think that all these things we're seeing happen during the pandemic, the celebration of essential workers, but also an awareness of the financial risks that they're facing, I think these are leading to a regulatory system where there are more protections for gig workers. And I think some of those will be lasting. They may take some time to develop and get them codified into law, but it looks like it's happening. And in the industries where it is starting to happen, first Uber and Lyft, you can hear them sort of consigning themselves to saying, okay, we agree there needs to be a pay floor. It's not a matter of if there needs to be regulation, it's just a matter of how much. And I think in these other parts of the gig economy, when we start to see regulations roll out, I think we can expect them to follow Uber and Lyft's model, where we say, yeah, we agree there needs to be change. It's just a matter of working out the details.
We're going to get a committee together. KUOW's Joshua McNichols. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, I'm Patricia Murphy, host of Seattle Now. Thank you for watching. If you think this work is important and want to support us, subscribe to our channel, leave us a comment, and check out KUOW.org for local news.